So here we're getting to the second chapter of Jonah, where we see Jonah's prayer or his song, and um, and how do we know that it's his prayer, or how do we know what he prayed in the middle of the beast? Um, well, because somebody wrote it down. It could have been Jonah, it could have been something that he memorized and related later on, or but the point I wanted to make out of that is that uh, we have this idea kind of, and it's about a 200-year-old idea that if our prayers are not spontaneous and just kind of made up at the time, that they're not from the heart somehow, and that they're not legitimate or real. And the problem with that is that it's kind of like saying that a love song isn't a real love song from the heart unless it was just sung at the spur of the moment and made up at that time, as if the crafting of it, or the sorting out of like what's going to be said and what the melody is and all that kind of stuff doesn't really make it, takes the spontaneity away from it, and therefore it's not as from the heart or something like that, which intuitively you can probably see what's wrong with that. And people have put down their prayers on pen and paper, and sorted out what they've and thought carefully about what they've wanted to say. Just like you're writing a letter, and you're thinking about, how do I construct this? How do I pick my words carefully? And in this case, it's poetry. So Jonah has a very poetic, very structured prayer or song that he's written, and it's from the heart, of course. Um, so um, and that's to say that, if you are, it's completely appropriate, for us to be able to, use written prayers. Often you can find written prayers that express, um, things more accurately than what we can think of right at the time. Somebody's got more of a poetic ability, or more of just more theological knowledge, or whatever else. And a lot of us have begun our Christian, the start of our Christian walk this way, by repeating a prayer that was, prepared, or in a sort of way, or given, repeat these words after me and wrap your heart around these words. Sometimes that's practiced, and sometimes it's a bit rehearsed. It doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is the what's behind it all. So I would encourage you to, be open to reading prayers, and I think it's also appropriate to begin certain things like, services, or weddings, or other things that we do within the church, with these written prayers. There's nothing wrong with, of course, the spontaneous prayers that we have, and that is part of our prayer life, and God hears our heart from where we're at. But it's not all there is, and there's been kind of like um, an overbalancing to that side of things, and I think that we've discarded some of the beautiful prayers that have been written in exchange for everything having to be spontaneous. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Now, concerning this monster, this beast, if you look at older Christian art, you'll often see the Jonah as being swallowed by some sort of a dragon, some sort of a sea monster, something like that. And there's a reason for that. Now, this is a newer kind of like re production from an iconographer. He's Orthodox, but it's a so this one is more modern, but you're going to see that it's sort of a recapitulation of some very old, some ancient Christian iconography and art. Um, so it's kind of typical. Now we'll discuss why this is important, because First of all, um, when we think of the great fish, or if we think of a whale or something like that, we're thinking in a sense of the way that Jonah was preserved. That's not incorrect, okay? That there is something to that. However, Jesus, when he talks about as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of, and the word he uses is a great sea monster in Greek, katos. Um, then he says that in that way the Son of Man is going to be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. In other words, Hades or the realm of the dead. So there is an element there where, like, the sea monsters always represented death or, chaos. It's much like the chaos waters. And there's definitely a sort of Leviathan um, messaging in this story. It's not necessarily an either or thing. So we begin we end chapter 1 with this verse, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. We get that from the Hebrew, which is the original language, and the word is dag. Actually, it's dag at one point, and then a bit later becomes daga, which is feminine. That's important because uh, the idea of the fish in the first place is it has several layers of messaging to it. First of all, there is the idea of a great sea monster, and it's a little bit cartoonish. Why is it being a fish this time? But the transition into the feminine makes the fish sort of a womb, a place where Jonah is being protected and that he's being preserved into new life being spit out on dry land, right? So you have this idea of, like, first he's being swallowed up by kind of like a sea monster and he's a dead man. But later on, we find out that that is actually a preserving into new life for him. This is kind of what the Christian story is, right? I mean, this is where Jesus says that he is going to be, he's going to descend into the grave, into Hades, but it's almost going to be like a birth, a rebirth, a womb. It's going to be transformed into something that brings new life. In the Greek, Katos, the sea monster, this is important because um, well, for the Septuagint, okay, so it's the Greek translation of the original Hebrew text, right? Is what the Septuagint is. It is what Jesus and the disciples primarily used when they were talking and when they were writing. So if you look at a quote from the Old Testament within the New Testament being spoken or written down by Paul or somebody, um, most often it is from the Septuagint version because they are writing in Greek. That's why sometimes you read in your Bibles something that is when you go and look back at the cross reference, the wording isn't quite the same as what you're reading in the New Testament, and that is because the wording in our Old Testament is from a Hebrew translation, and what is being quoted in the New Testament is from a Greek translation. There's this whole history behind that, which we're not really going to go into now, I think. But the word in the Greek is katos, which is typically a sea monster. I'm bringing this up because a lot of what we've grown up with is the term whale. What the word whale is because you can translate katos into whale, to be fair, okay? But here's the thing is that when we're reading the Bible, when we're trying to when you're using words like whale, it's an attempt at an explanation. How did Jonah survive? When we're reading fish, dog, it means something in the story. In other words, like Dagon was a god of the people in Nineveh. It's this kind of idea of like tying together things in the narrative, which that I'm very much into. If you've been with this Bible study for a while, you'll realize how important I think that the narrative of the Bible is. The other reason that Katos, a sea monster, is important is because it ties you to the Leviathan, to the Tanin, going all the way back into Genesis 1, and moving forward. So the whale doesn't bring you closer to the meaning of it. Whale is more of an explanation. Um, so as a rule of thumb, I would say default to meaning rather than explanation. Um, so both fish and sea monster, Tanin, Leviathan, etc., they carry meaning. Whale seems to be more of an explanation, and in my mind, seems to be detached from the meaning of the story. For an example, when we look at the story of Moses, for example, and this is going to come up, uh, when he is put into the Nile, he's being put into the Nile in a ark. It's the same word as Noah's Ark, right? It's in an ark made out of reeds. Think of that word reeds. And he's being put into the reeds or among the reeds as part of the story. Now, later on, when the Exodus happens and they are crossing the sea, our translations usually say the Red Sea. And that is an explanation because scholars haven't been able to figure out where the Sea of Reeds is, right? The literal translation is the Sea of Reeds. Now think about this. Red Sea doesn't tell you anything about the meaning of the story. But if you take it as the Sea of Reeds and just translate that literally, Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds, right? Then you have a connection to the beginning of the story where not you had Moses being preserved by the reeds, being put among the reeds where the children of Israel, the sons of Israel, were being slaughtered and thrown into the reeds along the banks of the Nile, right? Now you have Pharaoh's army being drowned in a sea of reeds. And there is your connection in the story. So that's why I say default to the meaning rather than the explanation, because the explanation kind of takes you out of the story. Here we see Jesus's quote, as just as for was Jonah in the belly of the great fish. Here it has katos, 3 days, etc. So there's your word. Now, here's where katos is in Greek culture, right? The Katia or Satia were the monsters of the sea, the two greatest of which were the katos, slain by Perseus at Ethiopia, which is Ethiopia, and the katos slain by Heracles at Troy. So they were the great sea monsters depicted as some kind of a dragon in Greek mythology, the Katos. Katia were usually depicted as serpentine fish with long rows of sharp teeth. Nereides often appeared riding side saddle on the backs of these creatures. So this is primarily the picture that you have even of the thing that swallows Jonah up in early Christian art. But here's the thing. Katos was also a generic word for any large sea creature and included Mundale whales and sharks. So in the balancing of things as an explanation, a lot of times when we translate it into English or other language besides Greek, it'll be translated as a whale, right? As an explanation. But and then the word fish in Hebrew is treated well. They didn't There's no real word for whale, and whale is just kind of like a fish included in the fish category in the Hebrew. Again, that's kind of like a working out of the um, and I've seen this even like in the church fathers who are all writing in Greek when they translate the church fathers into English, for example, um, they'll translate it as you'll read whale there too. But the same phenomenon is really going on. They're using the word katos and it's just being translated into whale. And you might consider just kind of scratching that out and just putting sea monster, maybe with a question mark. This is opinions, and see if that actually fits better with the narrative that they're talking about. Here's a little bit of a more old school kind of this is some Greek up here. Same kind of picture here where he's got his the song that he's written, right? This is a little bit of older art. You can see art that looks very much like this, even in the catacombs. Going all the way back, you'll see Jonah being thrown into the water, being swallowed up by some kind of a katos. Here's an ancient sculpture. Um, Again, looks more like a dragon, some kind of a dragonish. But this is Jonah being swallowed on one hand and then being spit out on the other. This one's from the 5th century. So if you go back to the sea monsters, and we're going to be talking about like the Leviathan, Tannin, and everything, because you'll see how this connects so intimately with the story of Jonah in a second here. God created the great sea monsters. The Hebrew word is Tannin, and every living creature that moves, with which the water swarmed after after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Here, when we go all the way into Psalm 104, it says, "Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, things, living things, both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play with." Okay, to play with. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. Now, Leviathan is just in the ancient culture, and this idea of the great sea monster is not just a strictly Israelite understanding of a great sea monster. This is all of their surrounding communities have this sort of idea of a great sea monster, and he or she is related uh, to the primordial kind of chaos and often to death, just like the chaos waters, right? So the redepiction of this kind of a chaos is that, first of all, God created it, right? That in most mythologies, you have some idea of the creator God who has to fight the great sea monster, has to fight Rahab or Leviathan or I can't think of the name of the the Babylonian one right now. But what you have in scripture, which is different, is that God doesn't have to fight anything or anybody. He just makes the great sea monster, and it's part of his good creation. And he's made you form to play in it, so there's kind of like a playful thing, like as if God's treating Leviathan as a rubber ducky or something like that. But then you also see other depictions where God is destroying Leviathan. So Leviathan is also kind of that God is triumphant over the sea monster, over the chaos in the waters. So we'll go to other verses that sort of depict that. Egypt, the seven-headed dragon. Rahab in the ancient Near East is depicted typically as a seven-headed dragon. If you think in seven-headed dragon in Revelation, you're kind of on the wrong. You're on the right track. Sorry, there is a connection there, definitely. It says here in Isaiah 30, for the Egyptians shall help in vain and no purpose, and to no purpose. Therefore I have called her Rahab Hemshebeth. In other words, God is calling the Egyptians and Egypt Rahab. Egypt is being depicted as a sea monster, right? Awake, put on strength. This is from Isaiah 51. O arm of the Lord, awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent? Are you not the one who dried up the sea and the waters of the great deep that made the depths of the sea a road for the redeemed to cross over? So this is talking about the Exodus, right? So it's saying basically, look, when you brought your nation of Israel across the Sea of Reeds, that you cut the serpent apart. You are the one who cut Rahab apart, and you crossed your people over safety. So, there again, you have the depiction as, uh, Egypt being a sea serpent. They represent chaos and death to the Israelite people. You divided, this is from Psalm 74. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the water. So we have like this idea of a multi-headed sea serpent. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. So here it's a plural heads of serpents, but then here you have plural heads of one Leviathan in pieces, and gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Here's a typical depiction that God in the end is going to destroy Leviathan or Rahab or the sea serpent or and then throw the body out into the wilderness, and the birds and the wild animals have a feast there. This is a depiction that you often see throughout Scripture. If you're familiar with Ezekiel 39, for example, and you see this in Revelation too. It says here in Psalm 89, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Think about what this here means in our story, right? You have Jonah who's in a raging sea, and then, but of course, God is the one who stills them. Same thing with Jesus, when he is on the sea and he's asleep, just like Jonah, like in the bottom of the boat. Only he's the one who stills the water, right? He's also the one who has broken Rahab in pieces. Here's Rahab, that great sea monster. You have broken Rahab in pieces as the one who is slain. You have scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. Again, this idea that the enemies of God's people are viewed as a sea monster or a dragon, often with multiple heads. There's all these world powers that are seen as sea monsters, not just it's not just Egypt, okay? So Isaiah 27, it says, in that day the Lord will, with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. So the idea of Leviathan gets merged with the idea of the serpent, and the idea goes all the way back to the serpent in the garden. The serpent in the garden is coming in from the wilderness, but there's something about the sea and the wilderness. They're both realms of chaos. They're both described as tohu wabohu, right? They're kind of like where the realms that are kind of deadly to men. Um, and this Leviathan is going to be done away with, uh, and not just the serpent that's in the sea, but the sea itself. In Revelation, that realm of chaos is going to be dealt with. Uh, Here in Jeremiah 51, it says Nebuchadnezzar. So now we're talking about Babylon, not Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. So the depiction is, like devoured me like a dragon, swallowed me up, right? He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel, He has swallowed me like a monster. He has filled his stomach with my delicacies. He has rinsed me out. Again, we're back to Pharaoh, Egypt, and the dragon. And behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of the streams, that says, my Nile is my own. I made it for myself. In other words, like this, he thinks of himself as a god or a dragon that has created the Nile or something. Um, it says here, I will put hooks in your jaws, just like a fish, right? You hook them in the mouth, right? I will put hooks in your jaws and will make the fish of your streams stick to your scales, and I will draw you up out of the midst of your streams with all the fish of your streams that stick to your scales. So we get this fish imagery kind of, mixed in here. And I will cast you out into the wilderness. Again, the wilderness, you and all the fish of your streams, you shall fall on the open field and not be brought together or gathered. To the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the heavens, I will give to you as food. So again, that feast for the wilderness animals. And by the way, the wilderness, monster that would be Behemoth. So you have sort of the sea monster, and you have the wilderness monster, the land monster, which is Behemoth. So here's Dag and Daga. We'll deal a little bit with like the more Jewish thinking, or I should say post Christian um, Jewish thinking that is not on the Christian side. Um, so Rabbinic Judaism, um, this is Hebrew, and they are going to, of course, default to the idea of the fish, which is perfectly fine. It's great, you know. Um, I looked at some midrash on here. Obviously, I'm not into midrash as that, like I believe this, so don't take it that I'm pushing any of this Rabbi Eliezer's ideas on you. What I want you to see is what's gone on in rabbinic Judaism and their thoughts, and and I'm going to build it into the criticism that they have against the Christian way of thinking, and and then I'm going to have sort of a Christian response to it. The thing is that even though you have this idea of a fish, you're not getting away from the idea of Leviathan or a sea monster here. In other words, in this thinking, you're going to see that the fish is to save Jonah, preserve his life, but that Jonah is actually going to save the fish from his destruction, because Leviathan was going to swallow the fish up. Okay. It's just kind of a strange story, but you're still going to see Leviathan and other things mixed in here, which will kind of fill in some of the picture here. So Rachel Adelman, she writes about Rabbi Eliezer's depiction of this. And she says, Jonah's fish was appointed from the creation to save Jonah from the tanin made on the fifth day. So if we're looking at the great sea monsters that were made on the fifth day, um, when we read that Jonah's fish was appointed, Rabbi Eliezer is seeing this as being appointed from that first week of creation, all the way from that fifth day, right? The fish had been lying in wait that whole time to swallow the prophet, not only to save him, but also to establish Jonah as the one who had vanquished the Leviathan in the end of days. So the fish is going to preserve Jonah, um, but Jonah is going to be the one who's going to kill Leviathan in the end of days. And you're thinking, well, Jonah at the end of days. Think about, I don't know what like Rabbi Eliezer is thinking here. I'm not getting into his brain. It's just funny that me as a Christian, reading Jonah as a type of Christ, then this is it's amazing to me that you would have the type of Christ in Jonah um, destined to vanquish the Leviathan at the end of days, which is exactly what Christ is going to do. He's going to get rid of death and the sea and destruction and the sea monster and the serpent, the dragon. So, Christ is the great dragon slayer, right? Um, he's going to crush the head of the serpent. Those are all kind of like ideas that kind of overlap each other. So it's interesting here that you would find something like that, right? So Jonah's basically after that, after he kind of scares off Leviathan, you're going to see then Jonah is taken into a portal that's connecting the creation days all the way to the ends of days and is given a tour of the netherworld. In other words, when we read Jonah's description here coming up in Jonah 2, that at the roots of the mountains and all these, the Sheol and all that. It's things that he saw, and that he was kind of given a tour of that. But this rabbi is painting not that Jonah is in that realm of death himself. It's just that he's being brought on a tour of all that stuff. Of course, within the sea, because the sea is the realm of chaos. So the fish is kind of showing him all those kinds of things. So Jonah confronts Leviathan. The prophet now enters a time beyond time in anticipation of the end of days, the realm of the drowned and the saved. There he confronts the Leviathan, who was supposed to feed on the great fish that very day, but Jonah taunts him with the fact that he will someday catch Leviathan and bring him to the righteous as a feast. Okay, this feast idea is going to come again, throwing him into the wilderness as a feast to be eaten. The fish said to Jonah, "Don't you know has my day has come to be swallowed by the maw of the Leviathan?" So this fish is talking to Jonah. It's interesting. And he says, "This is the day that I'm supposed to be swallowed by Leviathan." Jonah said, "Take me to him, and I shall save you as well as myself from his maw." He took Jonah to the Leviathan. So the fish brings him to Leviathan. Jonah said to the Leviathan, "It was for you that I descended to see your abode in the sea. And I will descend again in the future to place a rope through your tongue and haul you up to sacrifice you for the great feast of the righteous in the days to come." So think about this from the Christian point of view again. Okay, there's some truth in this, and there's because Christ is the one who is going to descend into the sea, into the realm of the dead, into the chaos waters, and he's going to defeat death, the great serpent, and he's going to defeat the sea monster in this way, right? I don't know if this rabbi is seeing this as Jonah as typologically of their Messiah to come. That's what I would imagine, right? That their Messiah is going to have to descend into the depths. I don't think that, that this rabbi is thinking the same Jonah, the same person Jonah is going to be, go and be the one who slays Leviathan at the end. I can't really imagine that. But again, I'm not in his head. As it says, how can you draw Leviathan by a fish hook? How can you press down his tongue by a rope? We get that from Job, right? So, how can you do this? Well, the ultimate Jonah, who to us as Christians is Christ, is going to do that, right? And not only that, but look at this sea. Actually, it's already done that. He's already defeated death. He's descended into Hades, and he's defeated the powers, right? And not only that, but look at the seal of our forefather, Abraham. Look at the covenant, Brit and flee. This is so. Jonah here proves that he is um, somebody with the covenant of God on his body. In other words, he shows Leviathan his circumcision. So let's just say he drops trowel and proves that he's an Israelite, right? Or he lifts tunic, however you want to say that. And the Leviathan saw the seal of Abraham, our forefather, and fled from the presence of Jonah a distance of 2 days. So, comedically, this scares Leviathan off. So then Jonah is taken on a tour of the underworld. So then Jonah said to the fish, well, I saved you from the maw of the Leviathan, so now show me everything in the seas and the depths. So number one, it showed him the paths along the bottom of the sea of reeds. Here we're back at that Yam Suf, the sea of reeds, which the Israelites had walked upon. As it says, the weeds, suf, it's the same word as reeds, entwined around my head. This is something you have to catch in Hebrew. That when we read in Jonah 2:6, the weeds entwined around my head, it is the same word as the reeds in the Sea of Reeds and the Ark of Reeds and the Israelite boys being thrown on the Nile, in the Nile among the reeds and all that kind of stuff. All that imagery is brought back to you in this Jonah story, right? So he is experiencing and I'm taking the Christian approach on this, is that he is experiencing the the death of the Sea of Reeds that Egypt's armies faced, and that frankly the 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 boy, the young, the sons of Israel that were being thrown into the Nile and being drowned in the water among the reeds, he's kind of experiencing that sort of a thing again. That's imagery that's definitely connected, right? This Jewish writer sees that. Now, my kind of complaint here uh, to this midrash is basically, well, if he's just being shown that, how come he's experiencing it to such a degree that these reeds are being entwined around his head? Obviously, to me, Jonah is experiencing a death um, thing himself. Okay, he's not just being brought on a tour of it. He's experienced it. It says here in part two, it showed him the great river Nahar of Oceanus, as it says, the floods, Nahar, engulfed me. So floods and rivers, the same sort of language. It showed him the place where the breakers of the sea and its waves emerged from, as it says, all your breakers and your billows swept over me. It showed him Gehenna, which is a word for hell, right? As it says, from the belly of Sheol, I cried out. This writer is connecting the thought of Gehenna to Sheol. I wouldn't do that. I think Gehenna is a separate thing from Sheol. That's another discussion. And it showed him the nethermost underworld of Sheol, as it says, you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. So when you're hearing in the Psalms, or if you're hearing here in Jonah, the bringing a life up from the pit, it's talking about the netherworld, right? This realm of Sheol. You hear this in David, and you're thinking, well, when did David die? And how can he be writing a song after he's died, or something like that? Well, how can Jonah be writing after he's died? And it's because of the way we think of death. Bible never talks about it talks about exile and death as sort of being the same thing, and it never talks about death as being the ceasing to exist ever. So that's part of a later discussion. We'll get more into that later. So here's a criticism from, say, like a Jewish point of view of the Christian view. And I'm going to read this first, and then I'm going to have a Christian response. So it says, usually the depiction of the fish in the Christian faith actually highlights its fearsome nature, even though this is not at all reflected in the biblical story. Well, I'm going to have a Christian response. It's fearsome nature, yes, but as a Christian, you're not fearsome of death. You're not fearsome of Leviathan. You're not fearsome of those things. In fact, you embrace them, right? But yeah, we get what this person's saying here. Even though this is not at all reflected in the biblical story where the fish is dispatched by God to save Jonah. Um, okay, so it's not at all reflected in the biblical story, but you still have to deal with Leviathan in the story. So, uh, you had to have this midrash where all this other information had to be put in to explain how the fish is there to save Jonah from Leviathan, which actually is not, I mean, that's not, you'd have to read so far and make up so many other things in between the lines that that's, like, well, we just read it, right? There's a bunch of stuff there that's it's very elaborative, and but we'll respond to this more completely. This apparently stems from the Christian interpretation, which saw the fish as actually being a symbol of death itself. Yes, because Christ said so. In effect, the Christian interpretation of the book of Jonah focuses, as its wont, on what appears to be a prefiguration of Jesus. Exactly. In this case, of his death. That's from a website called Visual Midrash. The Christian response of, like, is it death or is it the salvation of death? The Christian response, why not both? It is both. It's both salvation from death as well as going through death. In other words, the dog, which is the threatening, death fish, becomes the daga in the story. In other words, the womb that preserves Jonah. It goes from the thing that swallows Jonah up, like death, to being the womb for new life. Being born again implies death. In other words, if you're going to be born again, it means that you're going to have to die. This is an embracing of death. And I think, to be fair, there's a lot of Christians who've kind of lost sight of this idea. But Christianity is not just a simple hoping to be rescued from death. It's also an embracing of death in order to be saved. It's There's so much talk in the New Testament about dying or dying to yourself. Our initiating sacrament, the thing that we are born into the church in, our first sacrament, our first ritual as a Christian, or it should be, is baptism. In much of the church, they won't let you take communion until after you've been baptized, right? Because you have to be put into that community by baptism first before you actually take communion. And so that's why I'm saying, I'm saying this, maybe not in practice of what we do in our modern churches nowadays. But traditionally in churches, you wouldn't do any other Christian ritual until you've been baptized. That is your initiation, right? Our initiation sacrament, baptism, begins with being plunged into the waters in identification with Christ's death. You're saying, I'm dying with Christ. The way that he's being plunged into the depths, the way that Jonah's being swallowed, thrown into the waters and being swallowed by the sea monster is the thing that we identify with as Christians because we believe in a resurrection. Our victory over death is in the fact that it cannot hold us. We're talking about the resurrection of the dead, which means dying first, right? And death cannot hold us. That's the point. It will have to vomit us out, just like it vomited Jonah out. So now let's just kind of read finally Jonah 2. It says, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol, or hell, I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deeps, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. So this is a death experience. Okay, he's in the belly of Sheol. Um, then I said, I am driven away from your sight. This is death. Okay, the Bible talks about death as being two different things. Um, you could say that bodily death is the separation of the soul from the body. But it doesn't mean non-existence. Never means non-existence. On the other hand, real death, which is spiritual death, is the separation of the soul from God. That's what Eden was, um, driven out of sight. That day that Adam and Eve sinned, they died because they were no longer in the presence of God that they were before, right? That is their death. So then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet again, I shall again look upon your holy temple. That means I will see you again. That means I'm going to be resurrected. Whether you're talking about spiritual resurrection or physical resurrection, it's all here in the book of Jonah. The waters closed in over me to take my life, and the deep surrounded me. Weeds or reeds were wrapped around my head. So there again, I'm being drowned like Pharaoh's army was drowned, right? At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. This is a prison. This is the prison bars of hell, of Sheol, right? Roots of the mountains. Remember that first study that we did where you had sort of like that ancient cosmology. You have like the disk of the earth and then the pillars of the earth holding it up, and this is a description, the roots of the mountains. Where the bars closed upon me forever. This is an interesting use of the word forever. This is an eternal state. And it kind of means more like, okay, let me read the next line. Yet you brought my life from the pit, O Lord my God. So what does he mean by the bars closed upon me forever? Um, because next line he's saying, yet you took me away from there. Forever is in the sense that you can't do anything about it. In other words, it's final in the sense that uh, there's nothing left to do. There's nothing else. In other words, it's a sense of hopelessness and finality in that sense, but not necessarily a term, uh, a thing about finality in terms of time, or like that God cannot rescue you or something like that, right? When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came up to you into your holy temple. I don't think he's talking about the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's not talking about the temple in Jerusalem, because I don't think Jonah ever was in the temple of Jerusalem. The reason I say that is because he was in the north, right? So what's he talking about? This is the divided kingdom. He was in the north. The south was where the Jerusalem. Could he be referring to the Jerusalem temple? I don't think so. I think what he's referring to is just God's heavenly temple. Again, when you look at that Jewish cosmology, it's that temple in Jerusalem is directly connected to God's temple in heaven. When you read Revelation, you see God's temple in heaven. This is an idea that's been there from day one. The temple or the tabernacle that's made in the wilderness or in Jerusalem is the model, let's just say, it's the annex or the embassy of the heavenly temple directly connected to the heavenly temple, but it's still kind of like the extension of the heavenly temple. There's this idea of the heavenly temple being the main thing, which the earthly temple is a model of, right? Or an extension or yeah, I think an embassy of sorts is one way to describe it, you know. So my prayer came to you into your holy temple. When you pray and God hears you, he hears you from the holy temple. And we're talking about the heavenly temple. Those who regard vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. He's talking about, you know, the idols that the men in the boat who cast him over, and really the ones he's going to preach to in Nineveh. They have regard for these vain idols, but they forsake their hope of steadfast love. But with the voice of thanksgiving, will I sacrifice to you? What I have vowed, I will pay. So he's talking about the vowing that you know, this is the same idea of like the vows that the men who threw him overboard made to Yahweh. Salvation belongs to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. So here's what I'm going to conclude with. And we're going to look more closely at Jonah 2 next week. Even the Tannin is God's creation. On one hand, God made the sea monster, but on the other hand, he will slay him and feed him to the birds because the dragon is the enemy of God. I should have said it's the enemy of God's creation. It's not a direct enemy of God, but more like the enemy of God's creation. In Jonah, we see Leviathan as tamed and playing the role in Jonah's salvation by swallowing him up. So, you know, the fish is kind of a tamed down version of Leviathan. I think that's kind of like, well, that's the way I think that's the way I see him, and I think that's the way he's being seen by much of Christianity, is that the fish is a tamed down Leviathan in the swallowing. And it plays a role in Jonah's salvation by swallowing him up, like Tiamat's or Mot's. But in a twist, remember Tiamat, Mot, these were ancient death monsters. Death swallowed you up, right? Like Mot swallowed you up. But in a twist, the creature becomes the vehicle through which Jonah is preserved and brought to where he belongs in new life, I would say. In the end, the dragon, the serpent, will have his head crushed by Jesus and his followers. We're involved in this too. Paul says so in Romans that you know, God will soon destroy the serpent under our feet. You know, and instead of the monster swallowing the dead, like Tiamat and Mot swallowed their dead, death itself will be swallowed up in victory. That you're probably familiar with that. You know, death is swallowed up. You know, in victory. That is a turning around of the imagery where Tiamat or Mot or one of these monsters has swallowed you up and you die. No, now death itself is going to be swallowed up in victory and done away with because there's someone who's much greater than death himself. And there will be no more sea, just to kind of reiterate, you know, reconnect this to the chaos waters that we have. Anyway, that's about it. And we'll see you guys next Thursday.